Here is a very interesting question, which is rooted, in my view, in existential quest for what it is to be incarnated and having this human experience, personality, and how does that relate to the recognizing our full potential, recognizing our true nature. How does that affect personality, and how does that personality basically corresponds to the unified field that is the basic of that personality, which is the basis, which is the essence of that personality. But the question itself has some very, very interesting points which we would like to reflect upon. Here's the question. What happens to the person when they drop the body after fully having become enlightened? Maharishi has simply put it as the drop becomes the ocean. For me, I have always felt a sense of horror and dread to consider that to be the case, and I've never truly accepted it. As a devotee of my Guru, Maharishi's master Guru Deva, I have a very real and ongoing personal relationship with him on a very deep level. I've experienced him in my life for a very long time, even on a surface level. I've seen him in visions, and I see him become three-dimensionally animated in pictures I have of him. In any case, in my view, he surely is fully enlightened, and he certainly has not disappeared into the undifferentiated absolute. I feel this question comes from the inner conscious or unconscious desire to know whether or what happens to individuality as such, and in particular what happens to the individuality of one who has realized himself fully and yet still manifests in this phenomenal world. So let's look at it from both perspectives and see if we can bring it all together. And first of all, there is no coming and going. Nobody disappears into undifferentiated absolute. Because that journey, that appearance and that disappearance is only apparent on the relative plane of existence. That apparent paradox that something which is always there as the ground of creation manifests itself fully at all times, which is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient, and yet somehow becomes obscured to its own light, and then retraces itself back in order to cognize itself fully. So how can there be any disappearance or appearance indeed, if all that is already absolute? So we would have to bring this apparent contradiction into some kind of conclusion or some kind of understanding where that contradiction is being transcended in the light of our comprehension. So if we establish the fact, just for a moment, that all this is that ignorant, realized are all powered by the same light. Dormant state of consciousness, or fully established in itself state of consciousness, is nothing but consciousness. Then we can move on and ask ourselves a legitimate question. What does it take, or how does it happen that the consciousness becomes covered to a degree where it loses itself, so to speak? Because we'll go back to that process of losing its own light to itself and experiencing something other than what it is. In order for the incarnation to take place, in order for this manifested level of creation to be cognized in a human body, there have to be the presence of three states of consciousness. There have to be the waking, the dreaming, and the deep sleep. Why? Because these three relative states of consciousness, although they are just rotating concentric wheels around the main axis of permanent state of consciousness. The only permanent state of consciousness is Turiya, Turiyatita, and so forth, the degrees of the transcendence. And yet these three relative states of consciousness, they become very real on the account that each of them respectively rules over a particular body, which consciousness coats itself, as it were, covers itself, as it were, in order to manifest itself fully through this very creation we call life. So the waking state of consciousness corresponds to the body, physical body, the very structure, the molecules, the cells, the tissues, the whole entire organism that is formed out of these tissues. The dreaming state of consciousness corresponds to the subtle body, or else known as astral body, the body made of very fine vibrations, the energy vortexes, the energy fields, various degrees of energy fields, which actually much more subtle than the physical body, and that's what gives rise to the physical body. And there is a deep connection between the astral body and the physical body, because the vibrational frequency of each particular energetic vortex or center is corresponding to the endocrine system, which produces a qualitatively appropriate hormones in order to sustain and keep together the functioning of the human physiology. So, going further, beyond the dreaming state of consciousness, there is karmic state of consciousness. There is deep sleep state of consciousness. Deep sleep state of consciousness is associated with the karmic body or causal body, which is infinitely more subtle than the previous astral body experienced in a dream state of consciousness. That karmic body is characterized by having no possibility of having any experiences except witnessing that experience, because that witness, obviously, consciousness itself, is not separate. It is the coating that the consciousness is experiencing. Thence, it is always there. However, on waking up, let's say from a deep sleep, we never recollect what is there. It's absolutely blank. It's black. I always say it is the layman's nirvana. It is the state when a total rest takes place. They say, the neurophysiologists and people who study this different, degrees of body at rest, they say 5 minutes of deep sleep state equals to almost like 5 hours of dreaming. And there is a lot of truth to that. Because if you transfer that or translate that into the language of meditation, you can meditate for 5 hours with thoughts and sensations, and then you can have 5 minutes of complete falling into a state of deep sleep during the meditation, because that happens. And you have much more profound meditation than the one where all the thoughts are present. That's why it is called a spontaneous nirvana, so to speak. But obviously it's not nirvana, it's not samadhi, and it's another subject altogether. So these 3 states of consciousness, they are the coatings, and without them there is no personality, there is no individuality, and there is no possibility of having the incarnated life. Even traditionally speaking, the avatars, the incarnations of supreme intelligence of nature, when they come into this world, as some traditions, some lore of various cultures tells us, that they come to sustain life on whatever level it needs to be sustained, even those beings have all these 3 coverings, which kind of could sound a bit like a contradictory. How can, let's say Vishnu, the supreme aspect of absolute responsible for sustenance and evolution, has any karma? And yet it does. It has its own divine karma, infinitely more powerful and infinitely more subtle than any human karma. However, we will look into it further on to see how does this all relates to the ultimate. So the personality, or what we call person, it's consciousness coated, or consciousness which vibrates on the level of these 3 states of consciousness. And they permit, In their mutability we experience all this range, what we call, like waking state, senses, mind, full experience, dreaming state, and so on. We all know that to various degrees. So what happens to the being who undergoes this profound transformation and becomes self-realized fully, if we accept that as a kind of starting point? The prana gradually withdraws from the respective states of consciousness, from the respective conditionings. It withdraws gradually, and it takes the soul, the jiva, the atman, out of these experiences, so to speak. Gradually, manifesting more and more the conditions, or so to speak, natural conditions of the soul in its total identity with the Brahman, or with the Absolute. So the change happens, obviously, on the level of consciousness and within consciousness. It is the self that self-actualizes itself through that process. Because jiva, or Atman, does not exist on its own. Atman is Brahman, as the Upanishad declares. So it is obvious, we know that, and many teachers stress only that the ignorance is only apparent on the level where that ignorance is being perceived. What happens more likely is that there is this process whereby a powerful longing, yearning for that kind of connection prompts consciousness manifest itself in whatever form in front of the fervent devotee. And I'm not saying that that's a projection only. It's not that just this desire that somehow manifests that, shape of the living being that no longer exists in that particular space-time convention. But since it's all happening in consciousness, since it's all happening within consciousness, the question becomes obsolete. Who is responsible for that? Because the consciousness of the one who invokes that vision and the consciousness of the one who is fully cognized its identity with the Brahman is not separate consciousness. It all happens within the same consciousness. So consciousness is here, acts on behalf of both, let's say, and when we say both, we say that because of the limitation of the language. It acts behalf of the devotee and it acts behalf of itself. Because as we've established earlier, that who is manifesting is fully cognized its identity with the Brahman. So it all happens within consciousness. Thence the question of how is it possible that so-and-so has reached the level of self-realization and merged, as the drop merges with the ocean, as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi has laconically replied. And yet, he or she still manifests in that relative plane of existence. Are we following this? Are we fully following the subtlety of this whole phenomena? Well, if we are, then it takes us to the ultimate realization. And I'm saying ultimate realization only on that intellectual level of comprehension, which is that this relative and that absolute are not in opposition to each other. And one does not come from each other as in sequential way, so to speak, in order to appear, because that would also presuppose some very contradictory questions, like the cosmology deals with. And yet, because this creation is inherent quality of the Absolute, it manifests within, as it were, fully, and it is inseparable part of that which is indivisible whole. And yet when we try to cognize that, we have to introduce these polarities, we have to introduce these polarities, that there is this relative creation and there is that absolute, or undifferentiated absolute. There is this dynamism and there is this silence. Yet what we have to fully understand is that they're not two separate realities, or they are not even one that is reflecting the other. They are a totality of different levels of appreciation. The innermost silence, the absolute stillness, it's one of its qualities. And utmost dynamism, the pulsation, the vibration, its energetic, so to speak, manifestation, are just different degrees of its own appreciation. And they are absolutely inseparable. They are forever one. You cannot separate them. Separating them could create various philosophies and what have you, but could not gives us the direct taste of reality. So there is no coming and going. How could it be? Brahman is forever abiding in Brahman. then this whole dilemma of what happens to the person who has fully realized himself is only on the level of this, so to speak, what we try to comprehend with the mind, what is a temporary experience, that incarnated experience in space-time convention, which is forever inseparable, forever within the Absolute. And yet it takes authority of its own, that contemporary temporary eclipse, only to disappear and dissolve again. Because this person, this individuality, and this is what some seekers of truth, consciously as I say, or subconsciously, are being often confronted with. What is going to happen to me? What is going to happen to myself in that whole process of expansion of consciousness? Am I going to completely lose all the attributes of myself and merge and disappear with this absolutely undifferentiated, so to speak, absolute, where to talk about personality is almost, a nonsense, an oxymoron, because how can we talk about personality of something which basically is self-encompassing, and it's everywhere, and it's everything. So it already has everything that whatever we can name with the language and more. And yet, that's another mystery, that's another beauty. That's yet another one of those very, very, call them whatever, call them mystical, call them scientific, call them whatever is close to your heart, is that this very personality, it's an aspect of Brahman, or aspect of consciousness, the aspect of the Absolute, which is inseparable from the Absolute. And yet, it is never in contradiction with that undifferentiated totality, which dissolves and transcends that personality on all levels. The only thing I'd like to add to that is that sometimes this question comes from some others from a slightly different perspective. So what happens to the individuality of the one who has self-realized himself, and when he or she is still embodied, what happens to that personality? That this being loses all his or her personality and suddenly becomes this kind of godlike, translucent, what have you, being, devoid of any kind of personal attributes? Well, obviously it is not, and it is not possible. For as long as there is this physical body, and what is this physical body? We've established it already. In order for the physical body to exist, there have to be these coverings which are karmically conditioned. There have to be these three states of consciousness which are alternate and give that experience in that phenomenal world we call life. So the personality is not being burnt away, the personality is not disappears. Personality is still here to stay. Let's say someone who prior awakening and transformation and integration and full self-realization has had that kind of tendencies and nature, that is going to remain. Someone who was, let's say, very active, carried very charismatic, very strong aspects of his or her personality, that might only become accentuated. Or someone who was very gentle, very quiet, very peaceful, very modest, these traces, these trends may become even more accentuated. But all these are only surface expressions of the individuality which is already soaked in the bliss of itself, soaked in the identity with its own nature. And the only remnants of this personality is being perceived on the surface, usually by the others, because the one who undergoes that process no longer is capable to perceive any differences. But what appears outwardly is another story, is another matter. Lesha Vidya, it's called in Sanskrit. The remnants of ignorance in the one who has realized himself. And it's not the ignorance in the full sense of the word, it's just what remains from that state when consciousness was fully covered to itself. So the worshipper and the worshipped, the devotee and the guru eventually merged, they become indistinguishable from one the other. When that happens, nothing could be said about it. And that happens on the level of the heart. Thence, one can choose the path, of relating to the Absolute. Saguna or Nirguna, it's a matter of choice, because it's present in consciousness. Consciousness itself chooses whichever is, whichever path, whichever way of relating is one finds more appropriate. Thence now nothing is superior or inferior. All is accepted. All is part of that indivisible oneness. Jai Gurudev.